welcome back to the Doctor Who Marathon. I'm your host McEdam, and today we're going to be talking about the Sarah Jane Adventures episode, The Mad Woman in the Attic. Written by Joseph Libster and is directed by the amazing Alice Troughton. This story is mainly focused on the character of Ronnie, as we get to see some few aspects of her that have not been shown previously. So there we have some interesting ideas and topics to tackle with. But apart from that, in terms of talking about like the set of the story, not much is there really to talk about. Well, we're going to get into the stories. There's a bit of spoilers in this. But yeah, not really much to talk about in terms like behind the scenes or anything like that. This story is hugely praised by the Doctor Who and Sarah Jane Adventures fandom, considered to be one of the greater episodes of Sarah Jane, and I do understand why. There's a lot of things to like here. It also features the character of Eve, which we have an appearance on her but there. She looks really sinister, but actually like her. Don't know what that was. I do apologise. And so, and I don't know much about Eve. Whether she returns or not, I don't know. But the story seems to imply that she can return in later episodes. Whether she does, I do not actually know. Or whether she was planning to, but because of season 5, that never happened. We don't know. I don't honestly have no idea what is going on in this story, because we have a very strange concept in this, because the story starts off with this boy actually breaking into Sarah Jane's attic, but it's not Sarah Jane's attic. Oh no, because it's not set in the year of 2009 when the story was released. This scene takes place in the year 2059, which, for those of you interested, is actually the same year that Waters of Mars takes place. So there's a connection between this story and that, which is really strange. I don't know if there's anything that ties these stories together in terms of that. Who knows? But anyway, this boy breaks into the attic, which is in the future, and he meets this woman who seems to be gone mad. She's this old shriveled woman, and she seems to be by herself, and she stays all her time in the attic, and this boy mentions that he's heard all of these stories about the mad woman in the attic, and he asks her for her name, to which she reveals her name is Ronnie, and that is the pre-credit sequence. So right off the bat, we're having some time traveling shenanigans. Well, not really, because this story doesn't actually feature any sort of time traveling in that regard. In fact, this whole premise is a very bizarre one, because for the majority of the plot, the framework of Ronnie telling the story, or basically the boy asks Ronnie how she got like this, and Ronnie basically explains the events that led up to her being this mad, lonely woman in the attic. And I gotta be honest, I'm not too thrilled about the setup of this, because logically it doesn't really work. For the most part, the story seems to have nothing to do with building up the concept of her disappearing, and I feel like later on when you know what happens to Ronnie and what happens and how she is like this, it is really a big disappointment rewatching it back. But also as well, the framework just doesn't work, because there's a lot of scenes where Ronnie in the present day time, which is from the concept of the framework, Ronnie telling the story, there's a lot of scenes where she's not in there, and supposedly she's telling the story, and then see the logic of that doesn't actually make any sense. Do you see what I mean? And I feel like the framework, which is the reason why the story gets its title, The Mad Woman in the Attic, sadly is the weakest part of the narrative. Now, don't get me wrong, when you watch this for the first time, which I just had, doing it for the marathon, there is that interest. It's like, how did Ronnie become like this? Why is she mental? How does this story tie into the events that we're seeing now? But when you actually watch it, the tie into the main narrative seems very loose and very just not connected that much. And I feel like the story would have been much better, in my opinion, if it was told just like a normal story, or if the story within the framework had a much more interesting connection to the story, the older Ronnie story. So I won't be talking about the older Ronnie stuff because majority of it is just her basically explaining things, and she's like feeling sad and stuff. The actress who plays the older Ronnie is fantastic. I totally buy that she is an adult version of Andrea Mahindra, the actress who plays the younger Ronnie, the one that we're familiar with. And it does leave into some great scenes, storytelling-wise, in which we can actually kind of hear Ronnie's thought process, as like some scenes where she's in modern times, she's not saying anything. The older one is basically giving us the thought process, which for a younger audience might have been slightly necessary in certain scenes, so I really enjoyed that. However, I do feel like the story would have been benefited a lot more if the story was just told naturally from the perspective of the younger Ronnie compared to how it is now. So I won't be talking much about the older Ronnie stuff. So let's actually delve into the story, because Ronnie, she's feeling a bit down recently. She tries to like unearth some mystery. Something to do with lightning. Something to do with lightning. I've said that like 1,000 times. Sorry, my brain just fizzled out. Ronnie is trying to research something about this electricity, which she believes is alien, because as we've known throughout the rest of the series, that she is an inspiring journalist, and she basically looks up to Sarah Jane in a way that no other of the kids really do. Essentially, Ronnie actually wants to be the next Sarah Jane, in a sense. So that is a really interesting dynamic, and I really like how this story kind of pushes that, because Ronnie goes up to tell Sarah Jane what she's discovered, only for Sarah Jane to be kind of dismissive about it and saying that, oh, we had Mr. Smith already look into it, it's not aliens. And there's also this kind of dynamic as well, which I feel like actually really helps the story and makes it a really interesting dynamic, because Ronnie, unlike all the other characters, she's kind of new to the team in a sense, because even though she did appear earlier on in series 2, Clive has had only one story where he's not in the series, and Sarah Jane and Luke have always been in the series. So there is kind of those stories where there are a connection between these characters that Ronnie is out of, and it's shown here really well, because they're all laughing, they're all talking about Marie and how amazing she is, and they were talking to her, which a nice shout out to Maria, awesome. And Ronnie does kind of feel like she's left out in a way. She's kind of feels really down by all this, because she doesn't feel like she fits in, despite her being the one that wants to be basically Sarah Jane's protege. So that leaves in a really interesting dynamic and leaves Ronnie in a much interesting character position in terms of a storytelling narrative to make her a interesting protagonist for this adventure, because she gets a message from her friend from when she lived before she moved on to Bannerman Road. This boy who she'd been texting, and that she's actually been telling Sarah Jane's adventures to this boy. For some reason, soon after she moved, the boys just stopped having any contact, got rid of his Facebook, deleted it, just won't talk or anything to Ronnie, despite seemingly Ronnie being his only friend. But then all of a sudden this boy starts messaging her out of the blue, which kind of puts it interesting how we're seeing a little bit more of Ronnie's past. And basically the boy is asking Ronnie to investigate something that's happened in this local fairground in their old area. So apparently there are some children, some homeless people I should say, sorry, that have gone missing, and what all connects them is this fairground. And so Ronnie takes a trip to her old hometown. She meets up with this boy, and we see that there's this strange dynamic between them, because the boy seems to feel like he's been betrayed in some regards. He seems to be really aggressive towards Ronnie, despite Ronnie wanting them to still be friends still. And the relationship between her and Sarah Jane is pretty weak at this moment. In fact, Luke and Sarah Jane actually try calling her a few times, and she quickly puts the phone down. So there's this tension there. But it makes that this story is mainly focused on Ronnie, in a sense that we get to see Ronnie's interest of her basically looking into a story on her own. It's her basically trying to prove herself that she can do the alien and fighting monsters and looking into a story without Sarah Jane, without the Bannerman Road crew. So that automatically puts her in a headspace, and it does lead into some really interesting scenes where she interacts with the caretaker, who basically is clearly something dodgy with him, and he tries to get her out of his head, essentially. But she potentially breaks her ankle, and she basically questions him. Basically, she is basically journalising in there, and she finds that there's these homeless people. They seem to be sort of mind controlled to take on to the fair, and they start smiling creepily, and they start moving around. And also as well, there seems to be some sort of voice that the caretaker can hear, and he kind of seems to be some sort of innocent but tortured soul. This character actually reminds me a lot like Magpie from the Doctor Who story, The Idiot's Lantern. You know, that kind of innocent, but he's kind of has this dark secret that's kind of manipulating him in a sense, but it's a little bit different because this character does seem to genuinely care about this secret, about this individual that he's been keeping secret. And whilst this is going on, Sarah Jane basically learns that Ronnie lied, that she is going to Sarah Jane's house when she didn't, of course. And Clive basically goes to Ronnie's house to try and find out where she's gone, only to find the messages to this boy. And Sarah Jane, feeling absolutely betrayed by the fact that Ronnie has been telling their secret to this complete and utter stranger on the internet, or at least from Sarah Jane's point of view. And Elizabeth Sladen, when she says like she's been telling this boy everything, and this betrayal, that seems like such a great and interesting dynamic. And Elizabeth Sladen plays it perfectly. However, sadly, I think because the story isn't interested in that sort of dynamic in the story, but does quickly get pushed aside when Sarah Jane basically looks into this boy's life and realises that he is this orphan, and Ronnie's not only his best friend, but seemingly his only friend. So she kind of does understand that Ronnie would actually tell this boy the stuff in her life, and all about the stuff about Sarah Jane. I really do like this, that they brought it up. I wish it did delve a bit more. And I feel like the reason it wasn't tackled so much, and we needed a bit more of the Sarah Jane feeling betrayed, gets pushed away by the framework of the older Ronnie. But anyway, there seems to be this sort of demon, and it seems to be transports its consciousness through mirrors. It appears as a red face in the mirror, and this mirror also seems to grant people the ability to see moments in their past, but not only that, their futures. As Ronnie gets a bit closer, Luke and Clive and Sarah Jane basically find out where Ronnie's going and track her down to the fair. And so there's that dynamic, and Ronnie gets to meet this girl, Eve, the red-faced woman, as Sarah Jane and Sarah Jane and Clive. Sarah Jane and Clive go to the fair, whilst Luke tries to find out information more from the boy, because they go and meet the orphan boy, Ronnie's old friend, and Luke kind of has this, not this understanding, but kind of sympathise with his character. So he does tell Sarah Jane, it's like, I think I can get to him, which puts Luke in a very interesting dynamic, because we've never seen him. Usually it's Clive that's the down-to-earth individual, but Luke, Sir Joseph Lebster actually put Luke in this situation. So that's really cool, it's really fun, and we get some really fun moments with Clive and Sarah Jane where they talk about old age. But then it leads into, I'm trying to remember what the cliffhanger is. Well, yeah, it's when this face person basically appears to Sarah Jane, basically threatening her to step away, and they need this energy source known as like the darkness. This darkness is appearing in the future. And so that's our cliffhanger, and it's a pretty intense cliffhanger. But not as cool as the resolution, because this entity can't really harm anyone, but it can show them their past and their future. And so we have one of the greatest bits of reused footage in Sarah Jane, because this is the first time in the Sarah Jane adventures that we get flashbacks to classic series. We get to see the fourth, the third, and even the fifth Doctor from the Five Doctors, because remember, Sarah Jane was in that story. That's really bloody cool! And you get to see David Tennant as well from School Reunion and Stolen Earth and Journey's End. But we also get this tease of something yet to come. We also get the tease that Sarah Jane, we get a bit of Sarah Jane's future. And so Sarah Jane sees in her attic in Bannerman Road the TARDIS dematerializing in her attic. That is cool. That is some great setup for later story. When I say later stories, what I mean is later story, because the next story in the Sarah Jane Adventures is the return of the Doctor. So that's really bloody cool. So, and what's really cool about this is that, yeah, it kind of works in the framework of the story to some regard, leaving Sarah Jane this tease, this immobilization, in this vulnerable state in a mindset. But it doesn't really distract too much from the story, as Ronnie basically talks to this Eve character and discovers that she isn't actually a bad guy. She seems to be this innocent, childlike alien who is a refugee who got stuck on Earth because her ship crashed, and basically the caretaker has actually fostered her in a way. Basically, she's like an orphan after her parents were killed during a war that revolves around time, and her species were actually slaughtered due to their ability to actually read and alter the timelines. They are a time-sensitive race, and her race were, quote-unquote, exterminated. So, she is a refugee. She is a refugee of the Time War. So there's some really cool little connection there. We should, I don't know if this has happened, but there should be a story, maybe in a comic book or an audio drama, where the War Doctor interacts with these species, because that would be really cool in my opinion. I don't know if we get the name of the species that Eve is, but yeah, that kind of explains how that mirror thing, which seems to be connected to her, can show people their pasts and futures. But Ronnie takes an instant liking to this character, and she can also read Ronnie's mind, not in a evil way, even though it does start to seem like that at first. But there is this friendship, this bond, and what I really like about the story is it does feel like Ronnie's kind of being manipulated to some regard, as this Eve character reads Ronnie's memories, her mind basically is like, you tried to punish Sarah Jane when you weren't answering the phone, you kind of feel left out and you want to kind of punish them to some regard. As Ronnie gets a phone call and she says she wishes that that Sarah Jane would just leave her alone. I just realised one of the cliffhangers actually with Ronnie is that she looks into the mirror as Eve basically promises to show her her future in a vain hope of basically trying to calm her and show her that, you know, she is as good as Sarah Jane, if not better, but finds that she is the shriveled mad woman in the attic. And that is some really cool and some really interesting bit, and that's where kind of the framework really is only one of two scenes where the framework really is interesting and is kind of intriguing. But like I said, when you consider it to the rest of the plot, it is kind of dull in a sense with the framework, because we get this scene where Sarah Jane and Clive interact with Eve and Ronnie, only for Ronnie to basically take offense because Sarah Jane is like, step away from her, you have no idea what she's doing, she's dangerous. And Ronnie's just like, how dare you, I didn't even say anything and you already assume that I am in the wrong, I'm just this child to you, how can I prove myself as a protege to you if you don't give me the chance? And so there's this really heartfelt separation between Ronnie and Sarah Jane, as Eve basically, she sets outside and she seems to be getting a bit twisted as these homeless people that she's been mind controlled. She kind of doesn't see what's wrong with that. She looks around and she just thinks she's making them enjoy their life, seemingly having fun. And she also seems to have this kinetic energy power which allows things to move on their own due to the processes of her mind. But because she's a young version of her species, she doesn't have that big control of it. And we basically learn that she is a good person. She would stop it. After being told what she was doing is wrong, she does actually attempt to try and stop it quite early on in terms of the concept of her being a villain. And so she has to kind of rail it in, but she can't control it too well, even to the point of kind of controlling Ronnie when she tries to step away from her, because there's that dynamic that you can't see. But Sarah Jane talks to her, and that boy that Luke and Ronnie's old friend, the orphan boy, I believe his name is Sam. They basically come to the fair because he thought that that Eve is in danger, and it turns out that Eve is actually a really close friend to this orphan kid. And so to try and help her, to try and heal her, they take her to her ship, which is buried in the local beach. And we find out that the face in the mirror is actually the ship's computer systems. It's AI that is gained, that has this kind of godlike control. But it's also, like the species of Eve, a very time-sensitive being. And so it helps Eve easily when it gets back into the ship. As it seems to kind of wrap up pretty early, as Eve basically asks Sam and the caretaker if they want to travel with her, and we get this really heartwarming moment. I just remembered something. The caretaker is played by Elizabeth Slaton's real-life husband. That is just really cool casting there. But anyway, that's just popped in my mind. But before they go, the computer basically turns to Ronnie and is like, I need to grant you your wish. And shows a clip of Ronnie earlier on in the episode basically explaining that she wished Sarah Jane and all that would just leave her. And basically the ship erases Sarah Jane, Luke and Clive from the face of the timeline. That seems like a pretty big story detail, and that seems like a kind of cliffhanger ending, which would lead into a dark apocalyptic future, which will tie into the Mad Attic Woman story. But it doesn't, because that's kind of the end of the story, as we cut then to the older Ronnie, and it turns out that the boy she's been talking to, I believe his name is Adam, turns out to be not just any random kid from the street of Bannerman Road, but it turns out this kid is actually the son of Eve and Sam. And he, like his mother, has time-altering powers. And basically want to say thanks to Ronnie, grants Ronnie's wish of going back in time and stopping the ship from basically granting that very off-putted wish. And so the story ends with time being altered again, so that Sarah Jane, Luke and Clive were never erased from the timeline, and we actually get a sort of ending to the Sarah Jane adventures, or at least it's the latest point in the timeline, as we see basically the old Ronnie, but like the good ending, and that's how our story ends. Also, the ship needs a black hole energy source, which Sarah Jane just so happens to have a black hole energy source. That's what the ship was talking about when it said it wants the darkness in the future. It wants a black hole. And Sarah Jane contacts K9, which is trying to fix up the black hole in Switzerland, and does so by using that black hole, puts it into the ship, and so the ship can gain that energy. Meaning that this story is where K9 becomes a regular character in the Sarah Jane adventures. From here on out, K9 will have a much more prominent role in the series. So that's some really cool stuff. And the fact that we are watching this concurrently with the K9 TV show is really interesting. And we see the older Ronnie, and we see that she has this family. It's kind of implied that her and Clive get together because her children are kind of like the cross between skin tones between her and Clive. So yeah, because that's a lot of people's theories that they kind of got together. But anyway, that is Mad Woman in the Attic. Overall, it's a pretty good story. But I wish it could have been a lot better. The framework, in my opinion, doesn't really work for the most part. And the ending just kind of felt really rushed and could have been set up for a much bigger finale. But because it's literally like the last 5 minutes, it's just really strange. And I feel like the story would have been better if it was just told naturally. Some aspects, some of the characters do get underplayed. However, for a story that mainly focuses on Ronnie, this is a great entry into the series. So I highly recommend it if you're a fan of the Ronnie character. And Andrea Mahindra plays it beautifully. So there you go, that's Mad Woman in the Attic. So join me next time for a K9 episode. I actually have no idea what the hell it's about. So join me next time for Liberation. And I'll see you next time on the Doctor Who Marathon. Ta-da!